You believe the world exists even when no one is looking. You believe this room remains here after you leave it. You believe the sky stays above your head even when no eyes turn upward. That belief was never tested. It was inherited. From the beginning, you were taught that reality is stable, that things have clear shapes, fixed locations, permanent properties. A chair is a chair whether anyone sits on it or not. A stone is a stone whether anyone touches it or not. The world is supposed to stand there, complete, independent, untouched by your presence. No one ever asked why you believe this. No one asked for proof. It was treated as obvious, but the obvious is exactly what begins to fracture when reality is examined closely, not through intuition, not through philosophy, but through measurements so precise that old assumptions have nowhere left to hide. There is a quiet assumption you carry without noticing it, that reality comes first and observation comes later, that the world is already finished, and looking at it simply reveals what is already there. Like a painting hanging on a wall. Whether you look or not, the painting exists. But what if the painting only forms when it is seen? What if the world is not a completed object waiting to be discovered, but a process that only crystallizes when something forces it to respond? That idea feels uncomfortable, not because it is abstract, but because it attacks something deeper: stability. A world that does not exist independently is a world you cannot lean on. A world that does not settle on its own is a world that does not allow you to remain a detached observer. Because if reality is not stable, then your place inside it is not stable either. For centuries, human understanding has been built on the belief that the world is solid and indifferent, that it does not care whether you are here or not. You are a small creature moving inside a vast structure that exists entirely on its own. That belief is comforting. It allows you to feel uninvolved. It allows you to imagine that nothing you do reaches the foundations. But that comfort is fading. Something strange happens when reality is examined at its most precise limits. What appears is not a world that is already decided. It looks more like something undecided. Something that refuses to commit to a state until it is pushed into one. Something that does not choose a form, a position, or a condition until interaction makes avoidance impossible. No one went looking for this conclusion. It did not come from speculation. It emerged as a problem that could not be ignored once measurement became refined enough. And this is where the silence begins. Because if reality does not exist in the way you were taught, then this is not a small correction. It is not an adjustment. It is a rewrite, not just of textbooks, but of what existence itself means. If the world is not a fixed stage, then you are not a spectator. You are part of the mechanism, whether you agree to it or not. This does not mean the world is imaginary. It does not mean nothing is real. The claim is more subtle and far more unsettling. Reality may not be a thing. It may be a response. It does not sit there waiting to be seen. It appears when it is questioned, and without questioning, without interaction, without engagement, what you call the world may not take on any of the familiar shapes you trust. This is where many people stop, not because they are confused, but because they recognize the cost of continuing. To go further means accepting that the foundation of certainty has cracked. As long as you believe the world exists independently, you can stand outside it. You can say events unfold without you. But if reality only stabilizes through interaction, there is no neutral position left. You are always inside the system, always influencing it, always being influenced. That idea is not reassuring. It does not offer comfort, and it does not fit the story humanity has told itself for a very long time. That is why this part is rarely spoken plainly. Not because it is wrong, but because it collapses a familiar safety. You do not need to accept this yet. But there is one question you cannot avoid. If reality is truly stable, why does it only behave that way when it is observed? And if the world is always there, why does it need you to become definite? Something has been feeling off, even though nothing obvious has changed. Your routines still work. The streets still look familiar. People still speak the same language. The world appears intact. Yet underneath that surface, something no longer feels anchored. You may have noticed it in quiet moments. A brief sense that what you are looking at is real, but not solid in the way it used to be. As if the world is still there, yet slightly out of focus, present but thinner, reliable but not unquestionable. This feeling does not arrive as panic. It arrives as doubt without a source. You go through your day doing the same things you have always done. You wake up, you move through rooms you know well, you recognize faces, you respond automatically, but somewhere in the background, a question keeps surfacing without words. Something about this no longer feels final. It is easy to mistake this for stress, for distraction, for fatigue. That is the convenient explanation, the safe one. But it does not explain why the feeling persists, even when life appears stable, even when nothing is actively going wrong. What you are sensing is not chaos, it is not confusion, it is the quiet erosion of a certainty you did not realize you were relying on. For most of your life, the world felt like a firm structure you were moving through. It had weight, it had resistance, it felt dependable. You may not have thought about it consciously, but you trusted that the ground beneath you was not going to question itself. Lately, that trust has weakened. You still function, you still plan, you still act, but something in you no longer treats reality as an unquestioned backdrop. There is a subtle distance between you and the world. Not detachment, but hesitation, as if part of you is waiting for something to settle that never quite does. This is not detachment from life, it is sensitivity to instability. When the assumptions you grew up with begin to loosen, the first sign is not revelation. It is disorientation. Not dramatic, not overwhelming, just enough to make the familiar feel slightly unreliable. You may have felt it when looking at ordinary objects. A desk, a phone, a reflection in a window. They appear the same, yet they do not carry the same sense of permanence. The question is not whether they exist. The question is how fixed they really are. That question rarely comes with words. It comes as a pause. You might have also noticed a change in how time feels. Days still pass, but the flow feels less solid. Moments seem to stretch or compress without a clear reason. The future feels less predictable, not because something bad is coming, but because the old sense of linear certainty no longer holds the same authority. This does not mean you are losing your grip on reality. It means your grip is loosening because it no longer fits what you are experiencing. There is a difference between confusion and transition. Confusion scrambles meaning. Transition exposes the limits of old meaning. What you are experiencing is the second. The world has not become unreal. Your relationship to it has shifted. The silent agreement you once had with reality that it would behave in a certain way without question is no longer automatic. This can feel unsettling. Losing a sense of ground often does, but losing ground is not the same as falling. Sometimes it is the first sign that what you thought was solid was only a surface. You are not imagining this, and you are not alone in it. Many people describe the same quiet sensation. The sense that something foundational is no longer holding, even though nothing visible has collapsed. It shows up across cultures, across backgrounds, across lives that otherwise look completely ordinary. That pattern matters. If this were personal instability, it would look chaotic. If it were psychological noise, it would be inconsistent. But what people are describing is precise, subtle, repeating, a feeling that reality is still functioning, but not behaving the way it used to. That does not happen by accident. It happens when a deeper structure is being approached, when assumptions that once filtered your experience begin to thin, when the framework you relied on stops absorbing everything smoothly. You are not losing your orientation, you are sensing the edge of it. And that edge does not appear when something goes wrong. It appears when the familiar explanation of the world stops being sufficient. This is not a breakdown. It is not a failure to cope. It is the moment when the surface explanation of reality no longer satisfies what you are perceiving. The discomfort comes from mismatch, not malfunction. You are still inside the world. You are still part of it. But the way you relate to it is changing. The certainty that reality is fixed, settled, and independent is no longer automatic. That is not confusion. That is contact. You are touching the boundary where the old idea of reality stops feeling complete, And beyond that boundary is not chaos. It is a deeper structure that has always been there, waiting to be noticed. You are not disoriented. You are becoming aware. And awareness often arrives before understanding. Objects do not carry fixed properties waiting to be revealed. They do not hold a position, a state, or a condition that exists independently of interaction. This is not a metaphor. It is not an interpretation layered on top of theory. It is what repeated experiments have forced physics to accept. At the deepest level that can be tested, there is no such thing as a ready-made location. There is no hidden coordinate storing where something truly is. There is no stored condition waiting patiently to be uncovered. What exists before interaction is not a thing with attributes. It is a set of possibilities that refuses to choose. For a long time, people assumed the opposite. They assumed objects had properties whether anyone checked or not. Measurement was thought to be passive, like lifting a curtain to reveal what was already there. But the data did not cooperate with that story. When experiments became precise enough, the pattern stopped fitting. The outcomes did not behave like revealed facts. They behaved like responses. Position was not there until it was forced to appear. State was not defined until a question demanded an answer. Before interaction, nothing sat quietly in the background, holding a definite value. This is not because the information was hidden. It is because it did not exist in that form. Every attempt to preserve the old picture failed. Different setups, different systems, different scales. The result was the same. When interaction changed, outcomes changed, not slightly, fundamentally. There was no underlying list of properties that survived untouched. This is the part that unsettles people, because it removes the idea that the world is made of tiny objects carrying their own identities through space. Instead, it suggests something colder and far less intuitive. There is no position without interaction. There is no state without context. What you call a property is not something an object owns. It is something that forms at the moment it is demanded. This does not mean reality is vague or subjective. The outcomes are precise. They are repeatable. They obey strict rules. But those rules do not describe objects with pre-existing traits. They describe how systems respond when they are forced to commit. The commitment happens at interaction, not before. If you change the way you ask, you change what becomes real. Not because the system is confused, but because there was no single answer waiting. That fact was not discovered because physicists wanted it. It emerged because no other explanation survived contact with evidence. Again and again, the attempt to assign hidden values collapsed. There was no stable location behind the scenes. There was no definite state stored somewhere inaccessible. Only probabilities that resolved into facts when interaction occurred. This is why the old language breaks down. Words like object, position, and state suggest permanence. They suggest ownership. But what the experiments show is conditionality. What exists is conditional on how it is approached. Before interaction, there is structure. There are constraints. There are limits on what can appear. But there is no chosen outcome. The system has not decided because there is nothing to decide against. Decision implies a choice among fixed options. Here, the options themselves are shaped by the interaction. This is not philosophical discomfort. It is experimental fact. When scientists tried to rescue the idea of pre-existing properties by adding hidden mechanisms, those attempts failed. The results could not be reproduced without abandoning either locality or consistency. The universe refused to cooperate with the idea that objects quietly carried full descriptions of themselves. What remained was unavoidable. Properties are not revealed, they are produced. The moment of interaction is not a window, it is a trigger. This does not make reality unstable, it makes it contextual. Stability emerges when interactions repeat in consistent ways, but consistency is not the same as pre-existence. A pattern that appears reliably is not proof that it existed before it appeared. This distinction matters, because it means that the solidity you experience is not the foundation. It is the result of countless interactions averaging into something that looks fixed. At the base level, there is no object waiting, there is only a system capable of responding, and response is everything. When no question is asked, nothing answers. When no interaction occurs, nothing commits. The world you experience does not sit there fully formed. It takes shape when it is engaged. This is not a radical proposal. It is the quiet conclusion forced by decades of testing. It is not spoken loudly because it does not fit the language we inherited, but it stands there regardless, unmovable. Reality does not consist of things with properties. It consists of events where possibilities are forced into outcomes. Once you see this, the old idea of a world made of independent objects becomes difficult to maintain. Not because it is emotionally unsatisfying, but because it no longer describes what happens when reality is examined closely. Nothing waits with attributes intact. Nothing holds a position in secret. Everything appears when it is asked to answer. That is not uncertainty. That is how the system works. Something unsettling follows from what has already been established. It is not abstract. It is not distant. It sits directly beneath the idea of an independent world. If objects do not carry properties on their own, then the world you assumed was standing there without you loses its footing, quietly, completely. The idea of an independent reality depends on one assumption: that things exist in a definite way before any interaction occurs. Remove that assumption and the structure collapses, not partially, entirely. Because independence means something very specific. It means the world is fully formed whether anything touches it or not. It means events unfold on their own timeline. It means reality does not wait. But what happens when waiting is exactly what the evidence points to, and if nothing has a position until interaction forces one, then there is no silent arrangement of objects sitting in space. If nothing has a state until it is compelled to respond, then there is no finished inventory of facts hidden behind the scenes. This raises a question that cannot be softened. Without measurement, nothing is fixed. Without interaction, nothing commits. So what exists in the absence of both? Not philosophically, practically. If no one measures, there is no location. If nothing interacts, there is no state. Then what fills the gap that was once called reality? This is where tension begins to build, because the usual answers do not apply. The mind searches for something solid to grab, some fallback layer, some background that remains intact when everything else dissolves. But the background is exactly what is missing. The old picture placed the world first and observers second. Now that order no longer holds. Interaction is not something that happens inside reality. It is something reality depends on to take form. That reversal is deeply uncomfortable because it removes the idea of a world that simply exists. It removes the comfort of believing that everything is settled whether you are present or not. If there is no pre-existing structure, then reality is not a container, it is an outcome. This does not mean nothing exists when no one is looking. That is the wrong framing. The problem is deeper. The question is not about absence, it is about indefiniteness. What exists is not nothing, it is not something either. It is a condition that refuses to resolve into familiar categories. No location, no state, no object in the classical sense, only the capacity to become one. This is the part that most people avoid, because once you accept it, the idea of a detached universe becomes impossible to maintain. There is no longer a clear line between what is out there and what brings it into focus. You cannot say the world is independent if independence requires fixed properties, and fixed properties no longer exist without interaction. So where does that leave you? It leaves you inside a reality that does not fully exist until it is engaged. Not in a poetic sense, in a literal one. The fear does not come from uncertainty. It comes from implication. If the world is not settled on its own, then there is no neutral ground. There is no external stage where events simply unfold. Everything that becomes real does so through contact. This means the classical idea of existence was not wrong because it was naive. It was wrong because it assumed permanence where only responsiveness exists. That realization has weight, because if reality only stabilizes through interaction, then every stable structure you rely on is conditional, not fragile, but dependent. It holds as long as the interactions that sustain it remain consistent. That is a very different kind of world. In that world, nothing exists in isolation, nothing stands alone, nothing carries its identity independent of context. This is not a comforting conclusion. It does not tell you that you are powerful or special. It does not promise control. It does not imply meaning. It simply removes a layer of certainty that once felt unquestionable, and it leaves a gap. In that gap sits the most difficult question of all, not asked aloud, not easily formed. If the world is not there until interaction makes it so, then what is the nature of the reality you move through every day? What is the thing you call existence actually made of? Not objects, not places, not states. Those are outcomes. So what precedes them? At this point, the mind wants resolution. It wants an answer to stabilize the discomfort. But resolution does not arrive yet, not because it is withheld, but because tension is part of the structure. The collapse of the independent world is not an ending, it is a pressure point. It forces you to sit with a reality that no longer fits inside the old categories, a reality that cannot be described as a collection of things, or a stage, or a backdrop. Only this much is clear. If nothing exists with properties on its own, then the world is not what you thought it was. And if the world is not what you thought it was, then the question is no longer academic. It becomes unavoidable because you are inside whatever this is. The mistake was never thinking that quantum behavior was strange. The mistake was thinking it was small. For decades, the most dangerous assumption in science hid in plain sight. That whatever was happening at the deepest level of reality somehow stopped mattering once things became large. That there was a handoff point, a boundary, a moment where the rules quietly changed. Below that line, the world was uncertain, probabilistic, unresolved. Above it, the world was solid, stable, classical. That story felt reasonable. It matched everyday experience. It allowed physics to keep two pictures at once without forcing them to confront each other. But the story was never confirmed. It was tolerated. What actually happened was simpler and far more uncomfortable. The line was never real. It was a limit in how well we could observe. As technology improved, something unexpected began to happen. Quantum behavior refused to stay confined to the microscopic. It appeared in systems that could be built, controlled, and handled, not metaphorically, physically. Circuits large enough to see began to behave like atoms. Energy stopped flowing smoothly and instead appeared in steps. Systems switched states without passing through anything in between, not because they were small, but because they were isolated well enough for the underlying rules to show through. This was not a new kind of physics. It was the same physics finally becoming visible. The uncomfortable truth is that nothing magical happens when systems grow larger. No switch flips, no new laws arrive. The rules do not soften or simplify. They remain exactly what they always were. What changes is interference. Large systems are constantly interacting with their surroundings. Heat, noise, vibration, information leaking in every direction. These interactions smear out delicate effects until they blend into something that looks continuous and predictable. The world does not become classical. It becomes blurred. This distinction matters, because blurring is not transformation. It is concealment. When the blur is reduced, the underlying structure reappears. Not occasionally, reliably. That is why this realization took so long to accept. It did not overturn a detail. It overturned the entire explanation for why the world looks the way it does. The classical picture was never fundamental. It was an approximation that worked because it hid what lay underneath. When scientists first encountered quantum effects, they tried to quarantine them. They treated them as curiosities of the very small, a special case that could be ignored once things reached a human scale. That approach was practical. It allowed progress without confrontation, but the data kept pushing back. Each time isolation improved, each time control increased, each time noise was stripped away, the same pattern returned. Superposition, discrete states, non-classical transitions, behavior that did not belong to the old framework. Not because engineers force systems to behave that way, because that is how they behaved when allowed to. This is the breakthrough that science resisted for so long, not out of fear, but out of inertia. Accepting that quantum behavior is not confined to the microscopic means accepting that classical reality is not a separate domain. It means the solidity of the world is not a rule, it is a consequence. The world looks classical because interactions are dense, not because the rules changed. This reframes everything. Instead of asking how quantum mechanics turns into classical physics, the question becomes why quantum mechanics ever looked classical at all. The answer is not scale, it is entanglement with the environment. When a system becomes entangled with countless uncontrolled degrees of freedom, its behavior averages out. Possibilities collapse into patterns that repeat reliably, not because uncertainty disappears, but because it becomes inaccessible. The information does not vanish, it disperses. This dispersion creates the illusion of definiteness. It creates objects that appear to have fixed positions and stable identities. But those identities are not fundamental, they are emergent. They persist only as long as the conditions that sustain them persist. This is why the classical world feels stable, not because it is built from stable parts, but because instability cancels itself out at large scales. The breakthrough is realizing that nothing ever switched. There was no transition from quantum to classical. There was only a gradual loss of visibility. Reality never stopped being quantum. We stopped being able to see it. That is the reason this idea was uncomfortable, because it removes the safety of a layered universe. There is no upper floor where uncertainty no longer applies. There is no scale where the rules politely step aside. The same principles govern everything. From the smallest interaction to the largest structure, the difference is not what rules apply. The difference is how much of their effect remains observable. This explains something that was once puzzling: why classical laws work so well. They work because they describe averages. They describe outcomes that emerge when quantum behavior is drowned in interaction. They are effective, they are reliable, but they are not foundational. This also explains why attempts to treat classical reality as fundamental kept running into contradictions. The contradictions were not mistakes, they were signals that the description was being applied beyond its domain. Once this is understood, the fear shifts. The threat is no longer that reality is strange. The threat is that we built our understanding on a picture that was never meant to describe the base layer. Science did not want to say this openly because it sounds destabilizing. Not intellectually, but conceptually. It challenges the idea of a world made of independent objects following deterministic paths. What replaces that picture is not chaos, it is structure without solidity. A world where stability is not given, but produced. A world where objects are not fundamental, but persistent patterns. This is harder to explain, harder to visualize, harder to teach, but it fits everything. The experiments, the equations, the technology. Nothing needs to be added, nothing needs to be removed, only the assumption that classical reality was ever the starting point. Once that assumption is dropped, the pieces align. Quantum behavior at large scales is no longer surprising. It is expected. The appearance of solidity becomes something to explain, not something to assume. And the silence around this realization begins to make sense. Because once you say it plainly, there is no way back to the old comfort. The world is no longer a stage with actors moving across it. It is a process that stabilizes itself through interaction. That does not make it fragile. It makes it conditional. The breakthrough is not that quantum mechanics applies everywhere. That was always true. The breakthrough is realizing that classical reality never replaced it. It only hid it. And once you understand that, the question is no longer where quantum mechanics ends. The question is how much of it you have been unable to see. Reality is no longer understood as a collection of things sitting inside a container. That picture collapses once the deeper structure becomes visible. What replaces it is not emptiness and not abstraction, but a different kind of order. Reality is built from relations. It is organized by information. It takes shape through interaction. The shift begins by removing a silent assumption that space exists first and everything else happens inside it. That time flows forward like a river carrying events along its current. These ideas feel natural because they match experience at a human scale, but they are not foundational. Space does not behave like a background. Time does not behave like a universal clock. They behave like results. When examined closely, space looks less like a stage and more like a pattern of connections. Distance stops being a fixed separation and becomes a measure of how strongly systems are related. What appears far is weakly connected. What appears close is tightly linked. Location is no longer absolute. It is relational. Nothing sits anywhere by default. Position only becomes meaningful when something else can reference it. Without interaction, there is no place to point to. There is no coordinate to assign. Space emerges when relations form, not before. The same is true for time. It does not flow on its own. It does not tick in the background, waiting for events to pass through it. At the deepest level, there is no universal now advancing step by step. What exists instead is change, updates, transitions in information. Time appears when systems interact in sequences that can be ordered. When one interaction depends on another, a direction forms. When patterns repeat, duration becomes measurable. When memory accumulates, the illusion of flow emerges. But flow is not the base. It is a summary. This reframes everything that felt solid. Objects are no longer containers of properties. They are stable patterns of interaction that persist because the conditions around them remain consistent. A chair does not exist as a thing with inherent solidity. It exists as a configuration that holds together under repeated interactions. The moment those interactions change, the object changes, not symbolically, physically. Matter is not substance. It is behavior that repeats. This is why the world feels reliable. Not because it is built from unchanging parts, but because the relationships that sustain it tend to be stable at large scales. Stability is an effect, not a cause. Once this is seen, the idea of a world that stands there independently dissolves. The world does not wait fully formed. It does not exist as a finished inventory of objects. It updates. Each interaction is an update. Each measurement is an update. Each exchange of information reshapes what can happen next. Reality is not a static picture. It is a process that continuously resolves itself in response to contact. This does not mean the world is subjective. It does not mean it bends to opinion or belief. The rules are strict. The constraints are real. But what exists at any moment is determined by what has interacted up to that point. Nothing is simply there. Everything is there because something else has touched it. Information is the common thread. Not information as data stored in symbols, but information as constraint, as correlation, as the structure that determines which outcomes are possible and which are not. A system is defined by the information it carries about other systems, what it can influence, what can influence it, what it is entangled with. Remove those relations and the system loses its identity, not metaphorically, literally. This is why reality cannot be reduced to objects. Objects are summaries. They are the names we give to stable clusters of relations. They feel independent because their interactions are dense and predictable. But they do not exist in isolation. The world you experience is not made of things. It is made of events that keep happening in familiar ways. This is the reframe that changes the question entirely. Instead of asking where something is, the deeper question becomes how it is connected. Instead of asking when something happens, the deeper question becomes in what sequence of interactions it takes place. Space and time stop being containers. They become bookkeeping tools, useful, accurate at certain scales, but not fundamental. What is fundamental is interaction. Every interaction changes the informational state of the system. Every change alters what can happen next. Reality moves forward not because time pushes it, but because interaction updates it. The world does not stand still between moments. There are no moments waiting to be filled. There is only continuous updating. This explains why the universe does not behave like a machine running on a fixed program. Machines process inputs inside a predefined structure. Reality builds its structure as it goes. There is no master clock. There is no master grid. There is only a web of relations becoming more or less connected over time. From this perspective, stability is not guaranteed. It is maintained. The reason everyday reality feels solid is because the interactions that sustain it are massively redundant. They reinforce the same patterns over and over. Break those patterns and solidity dissolves. This does not make the world fragile. It makes it adaptive. The reframe also explains why measurement matters without invoking mysticism. Measurement is not a magical act. It is an interaction that forces information to update. It narrows possibilities into outcomes. Reality does not collapse because it is watched. It resolves because it is engaged. This is a crucial difference. The observer is not special because of awareness. The observer is part of the system because of interaction. A detector, a particle, a circuit, a body, all do the same thing when they interact. They update the informational structure. The universe does not care who or what performs the interaction. It only responds to the fact that interaction occurred. Seen this way, reality becomes coherent in a new way, not simpler, but consistent across scales. The same principles apply everywhere, from the smallest exchange to the largest structure. The world you live in is not an exception. It is the visible surface of this process. Your environment feels stable because it is constantly being updated in ways that reinforce the same outcomes. But that stability is active, not passive. Reality is being maintained moment by moment. Once this is understood, the old question loses its grip. The question of whether the world exists when no one is looking misses the point. Existence is not an on or off state. It is a condition that becomes definite through interaction. The world is not waiting in the dark. It is unresolved until engaged. This is not a loss of reality. It is a deeper version of it. The universe is not built from objects moving through space over time. It is built from relations exchanging information, continuously updating what can happen next. The world does not stand there. It happens. And it keeps happening as long as interactions continue. That is the reality now coming into focus. The fear does not come from instability. Instability has always been there. What unsettles is realizing how long it went unnoticed. The world you live in still functions. Streets still hold weight. Objects still resist your touch. Because still follows effect closely enough to be trusted. Nothing you rely on disappears when this picture shifts. What disappears is the belief that this surface layer was ever the foundation. For a long time, stability was mistaken for truth. Because things worked, they were assumed to be fundamental. Because reality behaved consistently, it was assumed to be independent. Because the world felt solid, it was assumed to be built from solid parts. That assumption was never tested. It was simply inherited. The unsettling realization is not that reality is fragile. It is that reality is deeper than the layer we learned to call real. The danger was never uncertainty. The danger was mistaking an approximation for the base. The classical world did its job well. It allowed prediction, it allowed construction, it allowed progress. But usefulness slowly hardened into belief. The model became the story, and the story became identity. The shock comes when the model steps aside, because when it does, nothing collapses. Instead, something larger comes into view. The world you experience does not become meaningless. It becomes contextual. Its reliability is not denied. Its origin is reclassified. What you stand on every day is not a lie. It is a result. The ground feels solid because countless interactions keep it that way. The clock feels steady because sequences repeat reliably. Objects feel independent because the relations that sustain them are stable at human scales. This does not make them fake. It makes them emergent. There is a quiet relief hidden in this, though it rarely feels that way at first. The universe does not owe solidity to be real. It does not need fixed objects to exist. It does not require a rigid structure to be coherent. Reality is coherent because its rules are consistent, not because its outcomes are frozen. The fear fades when this distinction settles. Nothing essential is lost. What is lost is the demand that reality behave like a static object. The surface world remains, but it is no longer mistaken for the source. This changes how uncertainty feels. Uncertainty is no longer a crack in the system. It is part of how the system stays flexible, how it adapts, how it allows novelty without breaking consistency. The universe is not unfinished because it is flawed. It is unfinished because it updates. What you experience as stability is not the absence of change. It is change balancing itself at scales you can navigate. This is why life goes on, why bridges hold, why bodies heal, why technology works. Nothing about this deeper picture undermines the reliability of everyday reality. It explains it. The fear only remains if stability is mistaken for permanence. Permanence was never promised. The idea that the world should exist independently of interaction was a comfort, not a requirement. It allowed distance, it allowed detachment, it allowed the fantasy that nothing you did touched the foundations. But reality was never asking for permission to be that way. The unsettling part is not that interaction matters, it is that it always did. The universe does not wait to be observed in order to exist. That question was never precise enough. What the universe does is remain unresolved until interaction makes resolution necessary. That is not fragility. That is responsiveness. Responsiveness is not weakness. It is the reason structure can form without freezing, the reason complexity can arise without collapsing under its own weight. The surface world you trust is built from this responsiveness, from relations updating moment by moment in ways that reinforce patterns you recognize. You are not standing on nothing. You are standing on process. And process is not less real than objects. It is more fundamental. The discomfort comes from realizing that the deepest layer of reality does not look like the things we name. It looks like change, correlation, and constraint. But meaning does not vanish when substance disappears, it relocates. Meaning was never in the object, it was in the pattern. This is why the world still matters, why actions still matter, why consequences still unfold. Nothing becomes arbitrary, the rules do not loosen. If anything, they become clearer. Reality does not care about appearances, it cares about interaction. Once this settles, the silence around these ideas makes sense. Not because they are forbidden, but because they require a shift that cannot be rushed. You cannot simply add this picture on top of the old one. You have to let the old foundation step aside. That takes time. The world does not demand belief. It does not demand acceptance. It simply continues updating itself according to rules that do not depend on human comfort. Your experience remains intact. Your life remains grounded. But the story underneath changes. The world you live in is real. It is just not the base. It is a surface that holds because something deeper keeps resolving itself into coherence. That deeper layer does not look like objects or places or moments. It looks like relations stabilizing into form. The fear dissolves when you realize this is not a loss of certainty. It is a correction of location. Certainty was never in the object. It was in the rules that allow objects to appear. Once that is seen, the universe does not feel smaller or colder. It feels more precise. Reality was not taken away. It was recontextualized, and in that recontextualization, a strange calm appears, not because everything is settled, but because nothing needs to be. The world keeps happening. You keep participating in it. And the ground holds, not because it must, but because the interactions that sustain it continue. That is not something to fear. It is simply the deeper truth we arrived at later than we thought.